So, if you know me, you know that I love Berserk and action games in a similar ilk to Devil May Cry or Platinum Games. So, when I first saw Soulstice revealed and saw how it looks like a combination of those two exact things, it seemed like a game made just for me. So, now that it's out, how amazing is it? It is the best looking PS2 game on the current gen market. The rest of the game is mixed though. Let's get into it. The story for this game is serviceable at best. It is incredibly average. It starts off explaining how this world came to be and uses terms like chimeras, the keepers, etc., and this exposition is really boring. Then we get a playable segment that takes place late in the game before flashing back to one day prior. We meet our protagonists, Briar and Lute, a pair of sisters that are sent into a city to close a rift and prevent the total destruction of the city and possibly the end of the world. From there, the story takes many twists and turns that are fairly rudimentary if you know anything about action games or dark fantasy or just certain aspects of storytelling. The organization that the protagonists work for might actually be corrupt. This one mysterious character is actually this character. This is what's going to happen to this character. Yeah, me being vague might make it sound like I'm bluffing, but I'm trying my best not to spoil. Anyway, the most interesting thing about the story doesn't come until the post-credits, but otherwise the story is basic and predictable, but it's not bad. It's just a story that exists. The characters are also pretty bland and predictable. Briar is the cynical and jaded badass, Lute is the optimistic but worrisome one, and Donovan is the mentor that is hiding info from the leads. It never gets more complicated than that. Only one gets development, and I hesitate to call it that. The sneaky, sarcastic, untrustworthy guy Leighton ends up trusting and befriending the girls. Riveting. I think that the problem is a lack of character for the characters. While there are bits of dialogue that have the characters show their personality, most of the dialogue is exposition, so it's difficult for the characters to feel believable when the dialogue is more about explaining what's going on than just people being people. This all being said though, despite the intro not giving out the best impression as to what makes this world unique and the story and characters being basic, I actually like the world building and lore in this game. Most of it is told through character dialogue and codex entries, and it is interesting. More interesting than the main story. The idea behind chimeras and how there are two people, one alive but mutated to an extent, and one a spirit, that are supposed to aid each other, but they are still destined to lose themselves and become monsters at some point in their lives. It's kind of fascinating, actually. Or the stuff told to us about the possessed monsters and how they work. It's not the most unique, but I want to know more about the world itself than the current happenings in the story, if that's worth anything. It's not horrible, but it doesn't do much that you haven't seen before or put a spin on the average story. It just is one, but the lore does help make up for it a bit. The visuals and presentation for the game are mixed, to put it lightly. Let's get the good out of the way first. I really like the designs of the characters and the enemies, as limited as they are. It's got an anime-esque design for the humans, armor, and weapons, yet it doesn't clash with the realistic environments. Most of the monsters have cool designs and are easily identifiable, especially the transcendent monsters. The environments have good lighting and textures, and late game has some really good looking environments as well. That being said, the environments are also bland due to lack of variety. Yeah, time for the negatives now. The levels are pretty much just the average old European cityscape with repeating environments and similar looking locations, so the aesthetics for the game can get bland and repetitive when all you see is the same looking towns, sewers, and castle interiors for hours on end. Also, I'm not sure if this was made on Unreal 4 and pushing its limits, or on Unreal 3, because the popping in this game is very distracting. Every time a scene shifts camera angles, textures can take 2 seconds to load, which can make the game look worse than it really is, when each camera shift might only last for a few seconds anyway, so each scene change will have texture load in to accompany it every single time. The animation in the gameplay is great, but in the cutscenes it looks very jank. I understand that the budget for this game is not AAA levels and there's probably no mocap used, so it's all hand animated, but looks very stiff and unnatural because of it. Also, while the game for the most part runs at a smooth 60 FPS, there are times where too many things are happening on screen and the frame rate can drop to around 15 FPS, so the stability and performance of the game varies in quality. So while not a bad looking game in the slightest, there are a few hiccups here or there that prevent it from looking and running as great as it could be. The gameplay is definitely the best part of the game, but there are some things that irk me. You have a weak attack, a strong attack, a dodge, and a counter-like button. Despite the main inspiration for this being old PS2 action games like Devil May Cry and God of War, the combat loop is closer to Bayonetta, as it's more about dodging and countering than flexing on enemies or tearing them apart. The main loop also seems to want the player to bounce from enemy to enemy, as opposed to focus on one then move on to the next, which is similar to a lot of modern day action-adventure combat, but still has the mechanics of a typical action game. There are a nice variety of weapons as well, and they all share upgrade types, but they all still have their own unique playstyles, so each weapon is easy to use and unique at the same time. You have your standard sword, a whip, bow and arrows, daggers, a fist, and cannon fist things too. The combat feels really fun despite its simplicity. While there is depth, it is very beginner friendly as well in terms of combat, so you can look cool while not having to practice all too much. I do wish that getting weapons meant a little more than how it is presented. Most action games make a big deal when you get a new weapon, and it's always exciting when you can see a potential new weapon coming. But in this game, they're just given out to you at random points, and they don't feel as earned. I just wish they made getting weapons special to go along with how fun they can be to use. A big mechanic in the game is that Loot has the ability to counter enemy attacks without you having to stop playing the game to do so. She's able to completely freeze enemy attacks, or parry them depending on timing, and if you upgrade her enough, she can actually counter on her own, alongside manual counters. While I like the idea, because of the need to bounce from enemy to enemy, the selective timing of the counters, and that frozen enemies will still fall through with their attack afterwards, the execution falls a little flat. It's not awful by any means, and it's a great defensive tool since you don't have any besides dodging, but things can also become hectic trying to remember if an enemy is frozen or parried, and that goes for off-screen enemies too. It's only really perfect for the boss fights where it can nullify attacks outright. And let me quickly mention my issue with the dodging. I can't tell if there are 0 invincibility frames or the frames are really tight, since there are times I try to dodge something only to get hit in the animation. If it is a literal dodge with a hurt box that doesn't disappear when you dodge, that's fine, but it's not made clear. This is a bit odd given that its inspirations had better dodging mechanics that had fair frames of invincibility, so I just wish I'd made more clear if the dodge has it or not. Besides weapons and countering though, the main mechanic of the combat has to do with red and blue enemies. My main problem with the combat is how much you have to juggle at once due to the colored enemies. Blue enemies can only be hurt in blue barriers and red enemies in the red. That's fair, and a good mechanic. But the problem arises in the late game where not only do you have a mixture of them at the same time, but when some red enemies die, they spawn blue enemies, and if you can't kill them in time, they will revive the red enemy that they spawned out of. So it's possible to be overwhelmed with the blue enemies while also fighting a damaged sponge red enemy, then defeat the red enemy, but not get the chance to kill the newly spawned blue enemies due to other enemies in the area, and the red enemy revives, and you just wasted all that time. I like the idea in theory, but I think that only some of the red enemies should have blue ones spawn out, and not pretty much all of them. That's really the main issue with the combat. Despite how fun it is, they throw too many enemies and mechanics at once that make things hard to balance, and more complicated than it should be. I like these mechanics individually, but together it becomes a bit much to handle. Or I just suck. There are some more aspects of combat that I need to go over. You also have synergy attacks, which are basically screen clearers once you complete certain conditions, but I barely use them due to 2 reasons. 1, it's not the most useful mechanic, and 2, once you get the Berserk mode, it is much more useful, at least to me. Oh, yeah, the 2 types of Berserker modes. Instead of using synergy attacks, you have the option to go into a super form that makes Briar much stronger, faster, and she is able to attack any enemy regardless of their individual mechanics, and I found that much more useful and fun over the synergy attacks. When health is low, Berserker mode changes, and Briar attacks on her own, and you have to do a minigame to calm her down so you don't get a game over. I understand the in-universe reason as to why you lose direct control over Briar and can only calm her down, but I can't help but wish you actually got to play as this crazed version of her. But having 2 of those would be redundant, so I get it. Also, I should quickly mention the platforming in this game. On its own, it's fine, but because of the fixed camera angles, it becomes much harder and much more unfair than it should be. It's counterintuitive to have a platforming section where you can't tell where you're jumping to. Just because your game is an homage to fixed camera action games doesn't mean you need their flaws as well. So the gameplay on the whole is very good, and I do like it, but there are some issues that hold it back from being as great as it could have been. The level design isn't that great. The fixed camera is a major factor as to why these levels are below average, but there's more to it than just that. While I'm glad that the levels aren't just fancy straight lines and are more maze-like, they also run into the issue of not knowing what the correct path is because of that. While this could be an issue with just me and not the game, so many times in these types of games when I don't want to go the correct way, I end up going the correct way, and when I want to go the correct way, I get lost. It doesn't help that the optional areas feel like hard progress when they continue on for a while, so you have to keep doubling back to figure out what is hard progress and what isn't. A map isn't needed, but because of the similar looking environments which blend together that I mentioned back in the visual section, plus no real indicators on where you are going, you'll end up running around in circles and missing whole bits of the level when you head the correct way by accident. Going back to that fixed camera issue, it makes everything I just stated worse. In a general sense, there's no issue with using a fixed camera angle, but it also requires really great placements to make it work, and let's just say, who thought that it was a good idea to pan the camera all the way back while trying to do platforming? The camera likes to pan back to show you how pretty the game is, which is fine, except when you're trying to explore and can't see where you're going because of it. The camera shifts during combat to allow for free movement. There's nothing to say we can't have that for normal levels as well, and have the fixed camera for moments where we don't need to figure out where to go. Like I mentioned earlier, because of the lack of variety in environment design, every area in a level starts to blend together, and it can make it difficult to navigate when so many hull designs are reused for multiple chapters, and because of the fixed camera, you can't really look around for possible environmental clues and have to hope the camera just shows you what you want to see. This gets better towards the end with the more varied design of the levels in terms of visuals though, and the level design evens out so you're less likely to get lost. But that doesn't excuse 87% of the game. So the level design leaves a lot to be desired. The bosses in this game, which are usually a highlight of most action games, suck. Well, a couple of them suck. There are a few decent ones, but a couple suck. Some bosses end up as normal enemies later on, which is fine, but the ones that don't are not great. There's not a lot of these more normal bosses in the game compared to mini bosses or bosses that become regular enemies later, but the ones that are in the game aren't fun to me. The bosses have their own unique mechanics that should be fun, but then the game pulls the cardinal sin of, this boss isn't difficult enough or unique enough, let's add enemies for challenge. That should fix it. While sometimes having enemies fight alongside a boss isn't an issue, most of the time it's used to cover up a mediocre boss. So if a boss is too easy or too hard or just weird to begin with, instead of focusing on that, now you have to worry about random enemies that make the challenge feel forced and not natural. Thankfully, the main named story-based bosses are good. They have some really cool mechanics that test multiple facets of gameplay, advanced story bits, and are just really fun to fight. They feel challenging and fair, and when you add the fun aspect to it, that's the sign of a good quality boss fight. I just wish more of the boss fights felt like that. Also, any normal gameplay issues I've had obviously carry over to the bosses, and that squanders their quality a bit. A positive I can give all bosses, though, is that their designs, much like the normal enemies, are great. Really unique and memorable and very creative. One thing that seems counterintuitive to me is just the basic structure of the game. For the most part, your first playthrough of any game is going to be the longest. That's just a fact. However, even if it is your longest playthrough, action games are usually on the shorter side, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours depending. This is done so that not only do you get better at the game and therefore you can get through subsequent playthroughs faster, but so that you can do multiple playthroughs and they don't take 50 hours or so per playthrough. It's something that's baked into the DNA of the best action games. Nowadays, the only reason it's a problem is that a lot of people feel that only games with dozens of hours of content are worth the price, and anything under a certain amount of hours is a rip-off. This game tries to have its cake and eat it too, and it doesn't work. My first playthrough was estimated to be around 10 hours of gameplay, which isn't bad for an action game, but with cutscenes, that time is about doubled, so 20-ish hours. The game still treats it like an action game though, in that it tracks how well you did in a level and how long it took, which can range from 10 minutes to an hour per level. Obviously, future playthroughs will be faster, but given how long levels can be without cutscenes, it doesn't incentivize replays, in my opinion. So this game wanted to have the long length to justify the purchase, while also having the aspects of action games that work when they're short, and I don't think it works. A few levels could have been cut and made for a tighter experience. This game's structure is just contradictory. Also, the voice acting in the game is mixed. Most performances are good, but some are barely serviceable, and it really varies per character. Overall, my feelings for this game are very contradictory and confusing to both me and the viewers, I'm sure. The story is basic, but not bad. The visuals and presentation have some issues, but it's a good-looking game. Besides some issues, the gameplay is really fun. The levels in this game are bad, and the bosses are of mixed quality. I know it's not a AAA game, and I'm not thinking of it as such when reviewing it, but there are still some fundamental issues that prevent me from liking it as much as I want to, and I really want to. It's not a bad game in the slightest, but it could have been better. I give this game a 7 out of 10. Bound by Ritual, reborn as Chimera.
May the Keepers watch over you, my friends.
Yeah, me being vague might make it sound like I'm bluffing, but I'm trying my best not to spoil. Yeah, not that there's much to spoil anyway. Ah, shit, no, I said anyway twice. Okay, well, this is what happens sometimes with improv. You can't just say words. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Also, while the game for the most part runs at a smooth 60 FPS, there are times where too many things are happening on screen. The frame rate can drop to around 15 FPS. 16 first-person shooters and 15 first-person shooters. Thankfully, the main named story-based Beelzebub